Okay, so we're going to be talking about the circulatory system, the respiratory system, and the lymph systems. And when we talk about these symptoms, some of the learning goals would be to label and know the major parts of the heart. You want to be able to differentiate between systole and diastole, and the three major types of blood vessels and the action of each one and the differences between them. You want to also be aware of, as always, some of those diseases of the circulatory system. When we talk about the lymph system, you're going to want to know several additional things. So for the lymph system, we want to be aware of the major components of the lymph system and what the function is. So you're going to need to know the different functions of lymph nodes and the ducts, as well as the spleen and the thymus, and then some of the diseases of the lymph system as well. When we talk about the respiratory system, you're going to want to know the general parts of the respiratory system, the functions of, for example, the different parts such as the nasal cavity and pharynx. You want to understand what inspiration and expiration are, internal and external respiration, and some of the diseases associated with the respiratory system. So the circulatory system, it's also known as the cardiovascular system. It has the heart, the blood vessels, and the blood. That's what the components of it are. It's referred to as the transportation system of the body, and its job, as you know, is to transport oxygen and nutrients to the body cells and then also take those waste products away from body cells. The heart is, when we think about the anatomy of it, it's a hollow organ. It's a muscle. It weighs about a little less than a pound, and we call this the pump of the body. And if you close your fist, that's about the size of your heart. It's interesting to think about the fact that the heart beats 100,000 times each day, and approximately 2,000 gallons of blood is pumped through the body via the heart. It's located in the chest cavity between the lungs and the sternum and above the diaphragm. It has three layers. It has the endocardium, the myocardium, and the pericardium. The endocardium is made up of smooth. It's a smooth layer of cells, and it is going to line the inside of the heart, keeps everything nice and smooth in there. The myocardium, this is the thickest layer, and this is the muscular layer. And then the pericardium, this is a double-layered membrane that surrounds the heart and helps to prevent friction. So that membrane has a fluid in between it, so that as the heart moves, there's no friction. It also has a septum, and a septum is a divider. So if you have a septum in the nose, we also have a septum in the heart, and it's going to separate the right and the left side of the heart. It also prevents blood from moving between the right and the left side of the heart. So the upper part of the septum is called the intraatrial septum, and the lower part is the interventricular septum. The heart has four chambers. There's the two top chambers, which are the atrium, and the lower chambers are the ventricles. And so if it's on the right side, it would be like the right atrium, right ventricle. On the left side would be the left ventricle and the right ventricle. Now, it's interesting to note the flow of blood through the heart, and we'll talk about that in just a second. In between all these different components of the heart, we have valves. So between the right atrium and the right ventricle, there is a valve. It's called the tricuspid valve. Between then the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery is the pulmonary valve. And then in between the left atrium and the left ventricle, we have the mitral or bicuspid valve. And then between the left ventricle and the aorta, we have the aortic valve. And what valves do is valves keep the blood from back flowing into the chamber. So when the heart pumps, blood doesn't go backwards. Here you can see a picture of the heart. We have the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. And the superior and inferior vena cava are going to dump here into the right atrium. That blood is going to flow from the right atrium through the tricuspid valve and into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, blood is going to go out an artery. Now, this is the only artery in the body that carries deoxygenated blood. So it's going to come out here, it's going to go there, and then it's going to go to this side, and that is the pulmonary artery. So this would be the left, and this would be the right pulmonary artery, and that's taking blood to the lungs. So then at the lungs, the blood becomes oxygenated and comes back in through the right pulmonary veins from the right lung, and the left pulmonary veins from the left lung, comes in and dumps into the left atrium. So this is then the only vein in the body that carries oxygenated blood. The blood comes from the left atrium. It's going to flow through the bicuspid valve down into the left ventricle, and the left ventricle has the thickest wall because it's pumping against the greatest pressure, because it's pumping all the way out to the body. So now when this contracts, it's going to push blood out here through the aortic semilunar valve. It's going to come up here and then follow in the aorta. So off the aorta here, it's going to branch like into the brachiocephalic and some other arteries. It's going to go up into the carotid artery into the head, and then it comes down here, and this vessel is going to come all the way down back behind the heart, and then this would be the aorta. It's called the descending aorta. Now, when we talk about the cardiac cycle or the electrical cycle of the heart, we have systole and diastole, and we talked about these earlier in the year. So systole and diastole, this is the contraction phase of the heart. Systole is where we have the greatest pressure. So remember when we talked about blood pressure, we said the systolic blood pressure, that's the highest one. That's the contraction phase, whereas the diastole or the diastolic is then the resting phase. So what happens is we have these conductive pathways. This muscle is special tissue that can carry that electrical impulses through. And so we get here at the SA or the sinoatrial node, there's an electrical impulse. It spreads across the top two atrium, causes the muscle to be excited, and then it contracts, pushes blood down and then into the ventricles. And then this wave will come down through the atrioventricular node into something called the bundle of His, and into the right and left bundle branches, causing the ventricles to contract and then pushing blood out. So the blood is carried through the body via blood vessels. We have three major types of vessels. We have arteries, we have veins, and then we have capillaries. So arteries, again, always carry blood away from the heart, with the exception of the pulmonary arteries. They are thicker walled. They have a bigger muscle layer, a big muscle layer. And the reason they do is because that muscle layer, the arteries are under a much higher pressure, so they need to be thicker. They need to be able to take more pressure. Whereas veins are not as thick. By the way, arteries lie closer in, deeper in the body, veins closer to the surface. And veins are going to carry blood back to the heart, again, with the exception of the pulmonary veins. They're going to be carrying oxygenated blood. Otherwise, veins carry deoxygenated blood. And then the smallest vessels, kind of the terminal end of the arteries, the beginning end of the veins, would be the capillaries. So the arteries are going to get smaller and smaller and smaller until they're single-celled, very small vessels, and they turn then into capillaries. capillaries, and then the capillaries is going to start the venules, so the smallest veins, and then the veins are going to get bigger and bigger as they move away from it. So here you can see the flow of blood through the heart, how it comes in. So again, it just is going to follow that pathway. This is out to the lungs and back in, like we talked about earlier. So for blood, we have the average adult has about 4 to 6 quarts of blood. We consider blood a tissue because it contains so many different types of cells. There's red blood cells, white blood cells, there's clotting cells, so we got thrombocytes. So a lot of different substances in there. Plasma, this is the fluid or liquid portion of the blood. It's mostly water, about 90%, and has a lot of different dissolved substances in it, lots of mineral salts, some nutrients, etc. Blood cells, when we think of blood cells, we have basically the red blood cells or erythrocytes, white blood cells or leukocytes, and then also some thrombocytes, and thrombocytes are the clotting cells. Some of the diseases and abnormal conditions that we're going to talk about in regards to the heart would be anemia, aneurysm, arteriosclerosis, and atherosclerosis, congestive heart failure, as well as emboli or embolism, hemophilia, hypertension, leukemia, myocardial infarction, phlebitis, and varicose veins. Now you will see in your notes section when you get to diseases and abnormal conditions of the heart, what I want you to do is I want you to take each of these disease conditions, anemia all the way through, and I want you to open your book and find the definition of each disease or abnormal condition. So you need to write these definitions down in your notes. So moving into the lymphatic system, really kind of works hand in hand with the cardiovascular system. It is very important, helps us remove our excess waste and fluids from body tissues. And again, working with the cardiovascular system. So when we think about the lymphatic system, you guys have probably all heard of lymph nodes, and so those lymph nodes get swollen sometimes when you're sick. Well, we'll talk about why that happens in just a minute. So what is lymph? Lymph is this thin watery fluid, and this is composed of intracellular or interstitial fluid that forms when plasma diffuses into tissue spaces. So you get some of that plasma from the blood. It diffuses out of the blood system, out of the arteries and veins and capillaries. It goes into that third space and is picked up then by the lymph tissue. Lymphatic vessels act kind of like drain pipes. They're located throughout the body in almost all the tissue that has blood vessels. And the lymphatic vessels we call them lymph capillaries, because these are the small open-ended vessels, and they kind of act like little drain pipes again. They are going to carry lymph and then helps that lymph pass, into the system. The lymph nodes are, we call them glands. We've got them all over the body. They usually have some like clusters and groups. And these little lymph nodes we really use these quite a bit. We feel for these lymph nodes because they are going to be an indicator of disease in the body for us. These nodes, what they do is they are going to filter the lymph, and they're picking up those impurities. So some of the stuff that they pick up would be like carbon, cancer cells, pathogens, disease-producing organisms, dead blood cells. So as they're getting all that stuff, when you have active infection going on or cancer, they start to enlarge. We feel lymph nodes, and if we start feeling enlarged lymph nodes throughout the body, we're going to have some questions about that. What is going on that's causing that amount of debris in the lymph system? Because that's really what they're picking up. So here you can see these lymph nodes and how they kind of follow along that cardiovascular system. We have a lot of lymph nodes here in the neck, down along and by the collarbone. We have them down here in the groin. And so we really pay attention to those lymph nodes. If we start to feel, thickening of those or enlargement of those, that kind of tells us a little bit about what's going on in the body. The spleen is an organ that's located on the left side in the back upper part of the stomach, and it produces white blood cells or leukocytes and antibodies. It is also responsible for destroying different cells, for example, thrombocytes and platelets. It can destroy old red erythrocytes or red blood cells also. And so it filters also some of the metabolites and waste products from tissue. Now, the spleen, some of you have had probably mono, and that's one of the things they look at is your spleen enlarged, or we'll see an enlarged spleen or a very active spleen sometimes in disease process also. The thymus really is a gland that works early in life. It's a massive lymph tissue. It's located in the center of the upper chest, and it really atrophies away after puberty. It just kind of gets replaced by fat and some connective tissue. But early in life, it helps with antibody production to help us fight infection. So some of the diseases and abnormal conditions associated with the lymph system would be adenitis, Hodgkin's disease, lymphangitis, splenomegaly, and tonsillitis. And again, for these diseases, I expect you to go to your book and look up the definition of each of these different diseases. Okay, so we're going to move on to the respiratory system. The respiratory system consists of lungs and air passages, and it is responsible for taking in oxygen, something that we need for metabolism and for life, and then removing the byproduct of using oxygen in metabolism, and that's carbon dioxide. So it's important to understand that the body only has about a 4 to 6 minute supply of oxygen in the blood. So if you don't get that replenished every 4 to 6 minutes, you will end up in death. The respiratory system is comprised of many different structures. Now, even though there's nothing written next to each of these parts of the respiratory system, I expect you to be writing these notes down, and I'll be looking for them when you turn them in. So the nose has 2 main nostrils or openings. There's a nasal septum. It's a piece of cartilage that divides the nose into 2 sides. And those nasal cavities are lined with mucous membranes, responsible for, it's also responsible for the sense of smell, like we learned earlier, and it has a lot of mucus in there that helps to trap pathogens and dirt. Excuse me. The sinuses, these are cavities in the skull around in the face area by the nose. And they are lined with mucous membranes that help to warm and moisten the air. They're also going to provide resonance for the voice, which is very important. Another important function of the sinuses is to lighten the skull, like we learned about in the skeletal system. The pharynx or throat, this lies directly behind the nasal cavities, and then it has three sections: the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. Nasopharynx, that's the uppermost portion behind the nose. The oropharynx is that middle section behind the oral cavity, and the laryngopharynx, this is the bottom section that branches into the trachea. The larynx is the voice box, and that lies between the pharynx and the trachea. And this has a little framework of cartilage. We think it's about it, we oftentimes call it the Adam's apple. This contains the vocal cords. And so when somebody's struggling, like I am right now, with their speech in their throat, sometimes that's because of irritation to the larynx. The trachea is the windpipe that is going to extend from the larynx to the center of the chest. It's going to carry air between the pharynx and the bronchi. And there's a bunch of C-shaped cartilages that are open on the back side of the body that helps to keep the trachea open. So they're solid to the front of the body, the anterior portion, but the dorsal portion or back portion is open. The bronchi, these are two divisions of the trachea. They're going to go into the right and left lung. And so as those bronchi branch off, they get smaller and smaller. Eventually we call them bronchioles, which means little bronchi. And then we have the smallest parts of the bronchioles, which are called terminal bronchioles, and they end in the air sacs, which are called the alveoli. So the air sacs then, they kind of look like a bunch of grapes. We have about 500 million alveoli in an adult person. And these are very rich in blood capillaries because, again, this is where the oxygen is going into the bloodstream and the carbon dioxide is coming out. When we talk about the lungs, we have a right lung and a left lung, and they're not the same. The right lung actually has three sections or lobes, a superior, middle, and inferior. The left lung only has two lobes, the superior and inferior lobe. And the reason is because the heart lies more to the left side of the chest, so there has to be room for it. The lungs are also covered by a membrane or a sac, and that's called the pleura. So here you can see the respiratory system, and I'm trying to make my pointer work, sorry. Let's see if it'll come up here, okay. Here you can see the terminal ends. Here's a little bronchiole, and it gets smaller and smaller. There's the terminal bronchiole, and it is going to end in these little alveoli. This is the gross anatomy of the lungs, the bigger picture. Here you can see the trachea, and then going up into the pharynx and the various parts of the pharynx. Now, it's really important to understand the process of ventilation. So ventilation means to breathe. Let me get that little guy down. So ventilation is the process of breathing. There's two phases of ventilation. There's inspiration and expiration. Inspiration is to breathe in, and we talked about this when we were doing vital signs. So when we're counting breaths, we had the inspiration and the expiration, and that was when respiration or ventilation. So inspiration, breathing in, expiration, breathing out, and again, one inspiration and one expiration is one respiration. And I do want you to understand that process. So when you breathe in for inspiration, what happens is the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles, those are the muscles between the ribs, contract and then actually enlarge the thoracic cavity. That means that there's a vacuum in there and air rushes in. Then when they are going to relax, that cavity gets smaller and then air is pushed out. Now we talk about respiration in two major ways, and one of them would be external respiration. So this external respiration happens here in the lungs. This is where the oxygen and carbon dioxide is being transferred at the alveoli. So once that happens, it's going from the alveoli into the bloodstream. There's that transfer there. That's external respiration. As the blood then flows through the body and goes to the cells, oxygen and carbon dioxide are also being switched there. That would be internal respiration. Some of the diseases and abnormal conditions associated with the respiratory system, we have asthma, bronchitis, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, so this is COPD, emphysema, epistaxis, which is a nosebleed, influenza or the flu, laryngitis, lung cancer, pleurisy, as well as pneumonia. Some other ones talked about: rhinitis, sinusitis, sleep apnea, tuberculosis, and then just kind of your standard upper respiratory infection. Now for each of those, instead of me talking about them all, I want you in your notes to define each of these. And I expect a good definition, not a two-word definition, all right? So don't just tell me that rhinitis is the inflammation of the nose. I want to know what's happening with rhinitis. I want to know a little bit about that disease process. Make sure you take time and talk about these disease processes in your notes thoroughly. Once you get done with your notes, you're going to go ahead and continue on with the rest of the process. Make sure you're getting your key terms for these sections and the worksheets completed. Thank you.